Welcome to Climate Optimists. I'm Jason Lewis.
And I'm Todd DeShida.
Thanks as always for tuning in. Whether you're a loyal podcast listener or you've just found us, we would love your help expanding the reach of the podcast. Assuming you think we're worth recommending, and I know that's a big assumption, tell your friends to subscribe on their podcast platform of choice. Rate us if your podcast platform allows for that. All that helps us get the word out about climate solutions and advancing our mission. I also wanted to call out that we had a vote on potential topics for December.
Yes.
Put out 4 choices, and the winner, after counting all the votes, was climate disinformation.
I knew it.
So we'll be having an episode on that in December. Coming in a close second was greener homes and buildings.
Nice.
And so we'll be tackling that topic too. That may be in December, maybe in January, but we're definitely going to dig into both. So Todd, I think you were able to drum up some reasons for hope this week.
I got a big reason for hope this week, and that is that the House just passed the $2 trillion spending bill, the Build Back Better bill. So pretty big news, really. This proposal would mark the biggest climate investment in U.S. history at $500 billion worth. So here's some of the kind of the highlights, I think. The credit on electric vehicles will be increased from $7,500 to $12,500 for cars manufactured in union-organized factories in the United States. And much like we talked about, I think when we talked about tax credits for electric vehicles in prior episodes, car buyers will get the rebates right at the time of sale instead of having to wait.
That's huge.
It's awesome. It will extend the credits for installing solar panels, geothermal pumps, small wind turbines, and other residential clean energy projects, covering up to 30%. Includes $6 billion for qualifying electrification projects, converting gas or fossil fuel-powered appliances to electric alternatives, installing heat pumps. There's another $6 billion in there to support home energy efficiency retrofits. Depending on how much energy saved, could range from $2,000 to $4,000. And raises $100 billion in tax revenue from fossil fuel companies, and includes a fee on methane gas to encourage companies to curb leaks. One thing that was left out of the wish list here was the Clean Energy Performance Program. But overall, it's a bill with a lot of stuff in it. It's a lot of money to clean energy projects, and I think it's a huge, huge deal.
That's big. So in today's episode, we're going to be digging into COP26, the recent climate conference in Glasgow that wrapped up, and focus not just on the outcomes, which have been covered to some degree, but really looking forward to sort of what's next, given that we didn't get all that we wanted. Before we dig in, how much, Todd, did you know about kind of the results here before you started your research?
Well, we'd been following it a little bit, and in some of our previous episodes, and I'd been following, mainly just following the news, so I hadn't really dug in great detail. So it was nice to kind of dig into some of the. And of course, you hear a lot of complaining. They're just talking and they're not doing.
Right. Yeah, similarly, I felt like I knew a fair amount of the highlights, but it's a little more nuanced when you dig into the details. And then I think there's this bigger question of, was it really realistic to think that it was going to solve everything, or should we feel good knowing that it made some valuable incremental progress?
For sure.
Well, regardless, for those who may not be super familiar with COP26 and why it matters, COP26 is short for the Conference of the Parties. In essence, all the countries that are participating in these global climate summits. The reason it's called COP26 is that this was the 26th Conference of the Parties. So the climate summit in Egypt next year will be called COP27.
Nice.
And I don't know, Todd, if you want to kind of talk or refresh folks on what the sort of the goals were of the summit.
Yeah, so they came up with 4 fairly simple goals here. The first being secure global net zero by mid-century and keep 1.5 degrees within reach. So that would be, accelerating the phase out of coal, stopping deforestation, speeding up the switch to electric vehicles, The second goal was to adapt to protect communities and natural habitats, restoring ecosystems, warning systems, and resilient infrastructure and agriculture to avoid loss of homes and livelihoods and lives from climate change. And third is to mobilize finance, spelled with a Z, because when I went to the the site that I found this from, they had mobilize spelled with an S and defense spelled with a C, and I was like, What is wrong with these people?" And I had to look it up. I'm like, mobilize with an S, and it was the British, I guess, spell these words all funky. And I was kind of thinking like, you lost the war, just spell this the way it's supposed to be spelled. So it was
You-
mobilize at least 100 billion in climate finance per year by 2020, and 4 was work together to deliver. And we'll see later, how all these turned out, right?
Some of our British listeners might take issue with the differences in spellings. I mean, they might view our spellings as problematic. I just wanted to play devil's advocate there.
I don't care what they. That's on them. Just kidding. So, I think next we will look at what progress was made in the gaps that remain. But first off, what grade would you, Jason, give COP26?
I think I'd give them a C minus. So
Ooh,
yeah, well, I mean,
that's pretty good.
there was some incremental progress. Certainly, we don't have, and we'll get into this. We don't have enough of the pledges in place to get us to where we need to go. We're still well short there, but I don't want to diminish some of the progress that was made.
That makes sense.
How did your parents feel when you used to come home with a C minus or a D plus? Was that considered success?
They said, "You went to school?" Uh, I You know, that's a good question. I think they would have been disappointed, but after a while, I think they just gave up.
They just accepted the reality.
I mean, most of the time I was okay, but I was always kind of lollygagging and had my head in the clouds about something. So I'm sure I brought home a couple C minuses my day. You were straight A's, and don't lie. Pretty
I
much.
might have done pretty well, but I didn't have my head in the clouds very much. I wish, in hindsight, I had the opportunity to do more of that.
You were nosing to the grindstone.
Pretty much. Yeah, all the way through. So we thought we'd start out with kind of, the bad news before we cover the good news. I know, Todd, you looked into where the conference fell short, and some of that, was on the financial side of things.
Yeah, the finance portion of this was insufficient. Developed countries committed back in '09 to provide 100 billion a year by 2020 through 2025, and we've not hit that. I think we hit 79 billion in 2019, which is still short of our goal. And basically, that funding was to help these developing countries become greener and more climate resilient, right? And the reality is that even 100 billion is not going to cut it. That was one of the gaps. So for the loss and damage fund, some of the vulnerable countries, have really been advocating for this, and it was intended to cover things like, disappearing land and loss of life. But developed nations, and the US was a part of this, unfortunately, really pushed back on this idea. And I'm not really sure why, but they did. They did end the agreement to agree to more dialogue about it. So, basically, we agreed to talk more about whether we should be giving countries who are suffering from this problem that really the wealthy nations have created here, right, in all their expansion over history. Um,
Totally.
so we've kind of created this problem, and are we gonna kind of bail them out here? One of the one of the quotes was, there's about 2 million people at risk of starvation in Kenya due to extreme drought, right? And Keriako Tobiko from their Ministry of Environment and Forestry was really disappointed in this portion of the summit and what happened here. And his quote was, "What we have in mind is not giving money to consultants to fly around and come educate us and teach us about what loss and damage is." And I thought that was pretty to the point, because I can totally see how this goes. It's like somebody flies in and walks around, and and they're really looking for results here, and they're not seeing it.
Well, and to be clear, the climate finance commitments that were made are, totally separate from this damage and loss fund. In other words, even this climate finance piece has fallen short, and now we're just starting to push the discussion of the need to compensate these countries that are going to be, in some cases, you know, irreparably damaged as a result of climate change. And
Right.
it's just ironic to me that, like, the wealthy country that created the problem is sort of wanting to punt this, even though we have the money and means to make it right.
Exactly. Well, I know that there was also talk of the targets for 2030 that were discussed here, and I know you looked into some of that.
Yeah. So as folks may be familiar, we really, with Paris, have been aiming towards this target of 1.5 degrees worth of warming. That is limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius,
Right.
based on what scientists tell us is really kind of a tipping point. And so the the pledges that came in for Glasgow help kind of narrow the gap, but only on the order of like 15 to 17%, according to the Climate Action Tracker. 15 to 17% is a start, but that's
Yeah.
not near where we wanted to be. And some of the problem was that targets weren't as ambitious as they should have been. In certain cases, you had big countries that just resubmitted their target from 2015, even though the way the language, the Paris Agreement teed things up, you're supposed to come with a more ambitious target. So like Russia, Australia just resubmitted their old target, nothing more
Right.
ambitious. You actually had countries that submitted a less aggressive target, like Mexico and Brazil, which is really disappointing. And then countries like Turkey that submitted no target. To give some context, if we look sort of towards 2050, we're looking at with all the existing pledges and targets, some of which aren't even binding, best case 1.8 degrees worth of warming. And then if you step back and look at like actual real world policies, what's actually been passed and is binding, we'd be on track to 2.7 degrees Celsius worth of warming, which would just be devastating. So the moral of the story is there was some small incremental progress. That's great, but there's a lot more work to go.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of where the rubber meets the road here, right? If whatever they're talking about or whatever they're doing there isn't going to do anything to actually limit these temperatures, it's kind of just lip service. And I think the idea too when you talk about these targets is that I think they're supposed to get progressively, progressively
More
more
ambitious.
more ambitious. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. And it doesn't seem like in some cases that was happening.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder with, some countries like Russia, whether they're not really broken up too much about the whole climate change thing, given that, they're finally getting to free up some of that Arctic beachfront property. Maybe Putin and his buddies are
Going water skiing or something?
I don't know.
Did he even come to this thing?
No.
He's already water skiing. He's not even participating.
Yeah, I mean, certainly what the citizens of Russia would look for in climate action is probably very different than their leader.
Right.
So that's sort of the bad news.
Yeah.
Moving to the good news, there was some real progress on methane reduction targets. So methane is about 80 times more potent than CO2, and so any real reduction there is really meaningful. And you had over 100 countries pledge to cut their methane emissions 30% by 2030. Those 100 countries, encompass about 50% of global methane emissions,
That's
which is
huge.
big.
Yeah.
Uh, Maybe not surprisingly, China and Russia didn't join that pledge, but nonetheless, that's
That's
definitely
significant.
it is significant and progress in the right direction.
Yeah.
Another major accomplishment was over 140 countries signing on to halt deforestation by 2030. And those countries cover roughly 90% of all forest land. You've got Brazil in there, which is obviously essential given the importance of the Amazon. Obviously, it's going to be key with the deforestation pledge to ensure oversight. I mean, it's one thing to pledge; it's another thing to make sure it gets done. But I think it's significant to have these 140 plus nations signed on to say that, that we need to cut deforestation.
All right. Next. Yeah, another big accomplishment at COP26 was the vehicle pledge, which was that no further sales of fossil fuel powered cars by 2040, which is a big deal. And the automakers that are part of this, GM already committed to 2035 phase out. Volvo has already committed to a 2030 phase out. And we had some exciting newcomers here. Ford, Mercedes Benz, and Jaguar Land Rover have joined this list as well, which is huge, especially with Ford. So, we have Ford and GM now that are phasing out in basically 2035, 2040. Unfortunately, notably missing from the list, Toyota, Honda, Volkswagen, Hyundai, Kia. Those are just among some of the automakers that are not part of this pledge. Notable countries that signed this pledge were the UK, all of Scandinavia, India, and Canada. So that's pretty significant, you know.
It's big. So yeah, I think this is definitely good progress. I mean, we got to focus on the automakers that got on board, and this just exerts more pressure on the Toyotas and the Volkswagens of the world to join.
Yeah, definitely.
And I thought that pledge was exciting too, because even though they'd said no further sales of fossil fuel vehicles by 2040, they were aiming for selling only zero emission vehicles in what they call leading markets, so more of the developed world by 2035. So really by 2035, phasing out fossil fuel consuming vehicles in major markets.
Yeah, that's huge. I would have never, guessed that 10 years ago.
It's true, and again, I it's like, while we got to acknowledge that there's shortcomings, some pretty major ones with the conference, we got to remember that we're still making progress, and this is a big, I think a big milestone.
Yeah, and it's nice that we're back, that the US is there participating. So,
Yeah, I mean, our two biggest auto manufacturers joining that list
yeah.
is big. And then there were some other, kind of key developments. This was the first time in any of these climate summits that there was an acknowledgement of the need to phase out coal and to get rid of fossil fuel subsidies. It's kind of shocking to me that this is the first time that's happening, but
Yeah.
nonetheless, and I think one of the other key outcomes was the fact that they called on all nations to really revisit and strengthen their 2030 targets by the end of 2022. So try to hold some of these countries' feet to the fire.
Yeah, that's awesome. There was also a kind of a surprise announcement that the US and China agreed to work together to strengthen and accelerate climate action and cooperation, which nobody really knows what that means yet. And it doesn't actually hold anybody to anything. But John Kerry seemed really excited about it and said, this is the first time that China and the United States have stood up, the two biggest emitters in the world, and said, we're going to work together to accelerate, the reduction. So I think it's a positive, even though we don't really know what's going to come of it yet.
Yeah, it's definitely good. I mean, it's a framework nonetheless, and gets that conversation started. So I think the big question for us, really, after come to terms with the accomplishments and the shortcomings of COP26, was this question of like, well, where do we go from here?
Right.
And you know, there are, I'm sure, many perspectives on what we need to do to move forward, but we thought we'd share our thoughts. I think it's important to step back and remember that not all emissions are created equally. In other words, we have heavy industry that accounts for 20% of global emissions, and while we need to get rid of those emissions, those are going to be harder ones to do. But on the flip side, we have things like electricity that accounts for, a quarter of global emissions, transportation, 14, 15% of global emissions. And the beauty is we've got the technology today to make those kind of transitions. And so in my mind, that's where we need to be focusing most of our effort. Like, let's not forget about the hard stuff, but let's take care of all the low-hanging fruit. And and as a reminder to people in kind of the timeline that we're looking at here, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said that we need to, cut emissions by roughly 50% by 2030. And we say that again, 50% by 2030, given that we're going into 2022. So that's a
Yeah.
lot of work to do. Um, and that's what's needed to keep us on the trajectory of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is becoming more and more kind of elusive. But I don't think it's outside the realm of the possible. It just takes thinking outside the box and taking current, actions, and instead of seeing them ramp up linearly, really ramp up exponentially.
Yeah, that's a huge number. But like you said, we should try to get as close as we can.
Absolutely. Each tenth of a degree that we go over 1.5 degrees Celsius means a lot. So if we don't hit 1.5, then we should be aiming for 1.6 or 1.7. The closer we can stay to 1.5, the less the damage, the less the potential for, irreversible damage. So, yeah, everything matters after 1.5.
Yeah, for sure.
So, how do we get there? What do we need to do as we look forward? I mean, the obvious is, seeing rapid cuts to fossil fuels. If you look at the Climate Action Tracker website, which does a great job of really assessing, current commitments and how they line up with what we need to do, they're saying we really need to look at phasing out coal completely by 2030. And so that's going to mean, closing coal plants in the developed world as quickly as we can. And then for those countries that are, in the growth mode, really ensuring that they jump directly to renewables rather than putting in coal plants. The other thing that we're going to need to do that didn't maybe get as much attention at COP26 in my mind is that we also got to stop or slow the growth of natural gas. And while we got to acknowledge that, natural gas is incrementally better than coal, it's still putting carbon emissions up in the air,
Right.
and that's problematic given that we only have so much more that we can emit and still expect to hit our targets.
Yeah, it's definitely not the answer is to just replace coal with natural gas.
No, I mean it's almost like, kind of switching from like hard alcohol to light beer. It's like you still drink enough of the light beer, you're still going to get drunk.
Yeah.
I mean, they're both problematic. Natural gas is just less problematic.
Right. Right. It'll still hurt you.
Indeed.
I feel like the fossil fuels thing is one of those areas too that's really a struggle, and I feel like there's a lot of these developing nations that are really expecting to be able to utilize fossil fuels for, cheap power, right? That's why we need the US and some of these other wealthy nations to really step up on that kind of pledge to get these countries the funds they need to make sure they kind of develop renewables.
Absolutely. That's really the key to this whole thing. I mean, in the developed world where you have massive deployments of renewable energy underway, I feel like it's much easier for us to mothball a coal plant. But in the developing world where their electricity needs are just exploding, we really need to give them that extra, funding they need to make the right decision on this. We can't expect that they're going to be able to get there on their own.
For sure.
And part of that too is not just incentivizing the development of renewables, but it's also subsidizing and ramping up the deployment of energy storage. And I know we talked about this on other podcasts, but if you want to get off of fossil fuels, it means you've got to be able to store energy for when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. And
Yeah,
so that's going to be a key part of this.
definitely.
The second pillar, if you will, I think that we desperately need to work on is blunting the fossil fuel lobby. And I don't pretend that that's an easy task, but let's be honest, these companies are still having a huge impact on countries' willingness to make the pledges that are needed to get us to carbon neutral. They're funding climate disinformation, they're buying influence with politicians, and the fact is 99% of it's going on behind closed doors. And so unless you're really paying attention, it's easy to overlook. There was, just recently, actually in advance of the COP26 conference, the US House held a hearing with oil execs to really kind of grill them on their support of disinformation. Unfortunately, when asked whether they would pledge to stop lobbying against climate action and undermine electric vehicles, their answer was no, which is hugely
Right.
problematic.
Yeah.
It's not unlike these opioid manufacturers claiming that their drugs are safe and necessary when we know that there's millions of Americans being harmed by them. And so, yeah, I mean, I think Congress needs to continue to take them to task. And, I'm excited to see that there are multiple lawsuits moving forward filed by states and municipalities that are really trying to seek for the first time damages
Mm-hmm.
from these companies, knowing that they knew the problem was there, and yet they continued forward promoting and in reality hiding a lot of the information they had that indicated fossil fuels were problematic.
Yeah, I mean they know what's going on, and they're just lying, and they've been doing it for a long time, and they pretty much are concerned with the almighty dollar, right? And that's
Yeah.
what's going on. I thought that Ani Dasgupta, who's the president of the World Resources Institute, he said it's inexcusable that developed countries failed to meet their commitment to deliver 100 billion annually starting in 2020, even as they provide hundreds of billions of dollars in subsidies for fossil fuels each year. That's pretty direct language there. Uh, and
He's spot
they're,
on.
they're right. So,
Yeah. I mean, it's yeah. I could rant on this for hours, but it,
of
it
course,
really is hugely problematic. And so in my mind, it has to be a focus if we're gonna get countries to make and adhere to pledges that are gonna get us to where we need to be.
agreed.
I think the third pillar is really pressuring other countries to step up their pledges. And while, in the US we only have so much influence, as you shared earlier about the Build Back Better bill, we need to lead by example, right? We
Hmm.
can't keep showing up with empty promises. And so we need to get this bill across the finish line so that we can show that our commitments aren't hollow. And and then it makes it easier to have that discussion with China or whomever to step up their commitments and to follow through. I think the other tool in our toolbox is a carbon border adjustment, which this is a wonky word, but in essence, like putting a tariff on goods coming in from countries that don't have aggressive climate targets and reduction goals. And, naturally that helps incent the creation of more aggressive targets on their end and implementation of existing targets. So, to me, those are at least two things that we have to be able to help nudge countries in the right direction.
Yeah. So that being said, what can we do?
Yeah, I think the most immediate thing we can do, at least for those listeners here in the US, is to call your senator and tell them to pass the Build Back Better bill.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think this is the big one here. And after you call your senator, light up Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema. You know what I mean? Like, just keep going. But yeah, I mean, the other thing we don't want to do too is hopefully that this thing doesn't get stripped down to nothing. So we got to support this thing and try to get everything that's in it across the finish line here.
Yeah, and I know calling up your senator doesn't feel like necessarily the easiest thing. I know myself, even after calling many a time, you still worry about how you're going to sound and making sure you cover all the bases. We will be putting resources on our website to help with that. And if you're not the kind of person who wants to pick up the phone, you feel more comfortable writing, that can also have an impact. So, in the big picture, I think we made some progress with COP26. There's certainly a lot more work to go. And I think at the end of the day, getting that work done really sits with all of us to make our voices heard. I know I rant about this often, but I really believe that it's the case. If we don't speak out, you know, clearly that fossil fuel companies are speaking out. We need to make our voices heard to ensure that there's a counterpoint on all this. So yeah, reach out and make that call or send that message. Well, that's about a wrap for today's episode. Thanks for tuning in. Come back next week for more climate solutions, reasons for hope, and ways each of us can make a difference. Climate Optimists is made possible by Climate Stewards Collective. You can find us on the web at climateoptimist.co. That's climateoptimist.co. And don't forget to follow us on social at Climate Optimist Podcast.